Adesso ascoltiamo con il professore Tuckett che sta per introdurci al problema Luke and the Q source.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for the invitation to be here. A slight apology for this paper. When I was first asked to come here, I said perhaps you might have got the wrong person because I am not really a Lucan expert, but some pressure was put on, so I said I would come. But I am still not really necessarily a Lucan expert, and my ideas here may be a little strange or idiosyncratic and a little hypothetical, but I offer them to you. My aim in this second lecture is to consider the question then of how Luke regarded his source Q, and for that matter, his Markan source, and I'm assuming the validity of the two-document hypothesis for the reasons I tried to outline in my first lecture. Ever since the rise of redaction criticism from the 1950s on, we have become used to regarding the evangelists as theologians, at times quite sophisticated, with their own definite agendas, which they used to shape the material they put into their Gospels, often in a quite far-reaching way. And all that work has thrown important light on each individual evangelist and the particular way he's shaped the material at his disposal. This trend has been developed further since the work of the early redaction critics, with the rise of so-called literary critical approaches, focusing more on the finished Gospels as wholes and as literary works in their own right, rather than on the small changes which the evangelists might have made to their sources. And this has led to a greater appreciation of the evangelists as authors writing with some considerable sophistication. As a result, the Gospels are often seen as primarily reflecting the context and outlook of their authors, rather than of the events of the story they are narrating. Yet it may be that some of this work has overplayed the evidence a little, and I will suggest in this lecture that this might be the case for Luke. In the case of Luke, we're in the fortunate position of not only having his Gospel, but also the book of Acts. Luke is the only evangelist who continued his story on after a relatively brief account of resurrection appearances to give an account of the history of the early church, which then gives us significantly more evidence than we have for the other three canonical evangelists for assessing the author's views, beliefs, tendencies, as well as his possible situation. Study of Acts is, of course, complex. We do not have any of the sources that Luke had available, so we cannot easily undertake the kind of redaction criticism which focuses on changes Luke has made to his sources. Indeed, Luke may have had relatively few sources in writing Acts. Certainly, many have argued that the speeches in Acts may owe a lot to Luke's creativity, Luke inventing and putting into the mouths of his characters what he thought they ought to be saying. And before we criticize Luke for this, we should remember that somebody like Thucydides does exactly that in his historical work. Part of the problem in interpreting Luke Acts as a whole is that the Gospel and Acts sometimes seem to speak with different voices, putting forward different ideas, a point I will come back to on several occasions later in this lecture, which then raises acutely the issue of how we determine Luke's own viewpoint. If two parts of the same work give different points of view, which one is Luke's own? And why does he allow apparent contradictions to be present in his overall presentation? What I want to suggest is that Luke is a historian, which I realize that claim is scarcely very earth-shattering or new. But what does it imply? I think first, it implies that Luke is claiming a place alongside other historians of the time, staking a claim to be heard on a par with other people writing history. The prologues of Luke and Acts both bear some resemblance to those of historians such as Josephus and others. He is then seeking to establish a claim as a respectable writer among those who might read his work, especially perhaps among non-Christians. Whether non-Christians did read his work is another matter, but presumably he would like it if they had. Second, it implies that the story of the Christian movement has a history, and indeed a long history. An important part of Luke's work is to show that history reaches right back into antiquity. The relatively recent events of the life of Jesus and his followers have been foretold in prophecies of the past, and there is a strong line of continuity, without a great deal of discontinuity, from the start of Israelite history through to the events of Luke's present, with the gospel events fulfilling the prophecies of the Jewish past. The theme is strongly pressed in many of the speeches in Acts, and in the way that Paul in the story in Acts is presented as still a Pharisee who is preaching nothing other than the true Pharisaic doctrine about the resurrection. In Luke's gospel, it comes out in the birth narratives, in the resurrection appearance stories, as well as the strong motif of the fulfillment of Scripture in the gospel, for example, the fulfillment of Isaiah 61 in the opening scene in the scene in Nazareth in Luke 4. And as such, this has a powerful note of apologetic, saying to a skeptical non-Christian audience that the Christian movement has a history and hence is not new. It was a standard charge against Christians in the early period that such a movement was discredited because it was new and hence had no ancestry. Luke's claim is that that Christianity is the true fulfillment of Judaism and hence can claim the whole of Jewish history and ancestry for its own. But third, and the main point I want to develop here in this lecture, is that Luke is aware, maybe, that the Christian movement itself has a history of its own. He seems to be aware that the time of Jesus and the start of the Christian movement lies in the past relative to himself. He is living in a different time, and perhaps things have moved on since the time of Jesus. Hence, what was perhaps the case in relation to various issues at the time of Jesus himself is not necessarily the case in Luke's own day. He is then aware of the pastness of the past in a way that arguably other Christian writers, possibly even other evangelists, are not. Well, how then does this come in relation to Luke's use of Q and his other sources? It would seem that Luke's attitude to Q is one of considerable respect. He seems to hold the source in very high regard. First of all, this may be shown by the fact that, as far as we can tell, he seems to have respected the Q order of material. He doesn't change the Q order, but preserves it mostly unchanged. Admittedly, this is in part an assumption, rather than anything which one can prove in any way, but it seems reasonable. It's certainly consistent with the way in which Luke seems to use his sources generally, namely using one source at a time and generally following the order of the source he is using, as I was saying in the earlier lecture. On the other hand, maybe we shouldn't overplay this too much. As I said in my first lecture, a procedure of using sources in a relatively simple way, using one source at a time, and generally following the order of the source one is using, was a practice that was widely followed by other writers of the time using sources. So his decision to follow the order of Q may just be dictated simply by standard conventions of the time. Second, where Mark and Q overlapped, Luke seems to have preferred the Q version of the common tradition to the Markan version. This certainly seems to happen in relation to the temptation narrative, the Beelzebul controversy, and the parable of the mustard seed. Not quite so much in the case of the mission charge, where he seems to want to include both versions. Further, he seems to know Q very well. For example, when he comes to the Markan story of the Beelzebul controversy and the parable of the mustard seed in the Markan versions, he hasn't yet included the Q versions, but he evidently knows there is a Q version of each, which he will include later, and so he omits the pericopes from where they occur in the Markan outline. So the parable of the parable of the mustard seed is in Mark 4, which Luke doesn't include until his Q version in Luke 13, And in Mark 4, he's only got up to his chapter 8, and he omits the Markan version in chapter 8, where he has most of the other material from Mark 4. Similarly, he omits the Markan version of the Beelzebul controversy in Mark 3 at Luke 8:3, using later primarily the Q version in Luke 11. So he appears to prefer the Q version where there is a choice, and he evidently knows Q well enough, or if, as some argued, he's done his preliminary homework and made drafts and notes about what he's going to include, so as to be able to deal with Mark accordingly well before he actually uses the Q version concerned. Third, and this is what I'll develop most in this lecture, Luke at times appears to preserve the Q wording of individual sayings, even when it does not quite match up with his own ideas. And this happens in quite a lot of instances. First of all, wisdom texts, and these are some of the texts I referred to in the previous lecture. I consider first the Q sayings which appear to refer to Jesus as one of the envoys of personified wisdom. This idea seems to be implied in the sayings in Luke 7:35. That's the first of these sayings in the thing above. Wisdom is justified by her children. And Luke 11:49. Therefore, the wisdom of God said, I will send you prophets. I looked at these in the first lecture and argued then that Luke probably gives the more original Q version. Matthew upgrades the sayings by implicitly identifying Jesus with the figure of wisdom. So in the second saying in Matthew is no longer a saying of wisdom, but a saying of Jesus. Therefore, I am sending you prophets, and so on. And in the first saying, wisdom is justified by her works, linking, as I said earlier, with the reference at the start of the pericope to the works of the Messiah. And a significant part of the argument I was trying to say in the previous lecture for the greater originality of the Lucan version was that the ideas which seem to lie behind these sayings are rather foreign to Luke. Nowhere else in Luke Acts, apart from these Q sayings, does Luke hint at an idea of personified wisdom, let alone an idea that wisdom was the agent in sending out prophetic messengers, even though this does pick up some significant strands from Jewish sources. The idea does come in these two sayings, which on the two-document hypothesis are coming to Luke from one of his two sources, namely Q, and they come nowhere else, and certainly not, say, in any of the speeches in Acts. So in terms of discussions of the synoptic problem, it's unlikely that Luke himself would have changed the Matthean version to create this idea, so Luke probably preserves the Q wording unchanged at this point. But then it may be equally significant for the purposes of this lecture that Luke does not change the tradition to align it more with his own views. He appears to respect it enough to leave it unaltered. Luke is thus apparently aware that some of the things attributed to Jesus do not necessarily align with later claims made about him by early Christians, or even made by Luke himself. However much Jesus himself is revered in Luke's own day as the center and the focus of the Christian movement, and he quite clearly is, it would seem that Luke is happy quietly to acknowledge some kind of a gap between the things said or done by Jesus in the past and Luke's own present. Second section on the Son of Man sayings in Luke. A similar picture may emerge from a number of other features of Luke's gospel when compared with Acts. Luke shares with all the other canonical gospel writers and Q in having Jesus speak on several occasions about a figure called the Son of Man. The whole Son of Man debate has proved enormously complex over the years, with many, many competing theories about what Jesus himself might have meant in using the phrase, if indeed he did use the phrase, what the evangelists meant, though there's been less debate at that level, how the tradition might have changed as it moved from the historical Jesus through to the evangelists, what the most appropriate background in Jewish thought and or language or elsewhere might be, and so on and so on. I think, though, it is reasonably well agreed that by the time one gets to the canonical Gospels, the picture has some clarity. First, the Son of Man is Jesus and Jesus alone. This is for the Gospel writers. Whether this is true for Jesus is another matter. As Son of Man, Jesus will play a decisive role in the final judgment, though quite what that role is not clear. And third, some of Jesus' activities during his lifetime can be put in terms of himself as the Son of Man. Perhaps too, fourth, Jesus' role in suffering and dying can be predicated of himself as Son of Man. Maybe that the last, the idea of the suffering and dying Son of Man figure, is a particularly Markan development, though it is taken on by Matthew and Luke from Mark. For what it is worth, I would argue that the same idea recurs implicitly in Q as well, but that's another issue. Luke is no exception to the general rule of the canonical evangelists. Like the others, he has many sayings, some from Mark, some from Q, some from his own tradition, some perhaps from his own pen, covering the full range of the categories into which the Son of Man's sayings are traditionally divided. So he has sayings from Mark and Q about aspects of Jesus' activity in his own lifetime, predicated of Jesus as the Son of Man. He has sayings mostly from Mark about Jesus' future sufferings as Son of Man. And he has sayings from Mark and Q about Jesus as playing a significant role in a future eschatological scenario. Luke takes over all the sayings about Jesus as Son of Man from Mark. The same is probably true of Q. Some of the Q sayings are slightly uncertain, since in some cases it's only the Lucan version of the saying which is in the form of a saying about Jesus as the Son of Man. Matthew has the saying in the first person singular. So my first example that's up there from Luke 12, 8-9, and Matthew 10, in Matthew, it is not a Son of Man saying at all. In Luke, it is. Whoever acknowledges me before others. In Luke, the Son of Man will acknowledge before the angels of God. In Matthew, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. I won't go into the other. There are other differences, I know, between the two versions of the saying, but just simply at this point to note that in Luke, it is a reference. Jesus refers to the Son of Man. Matthew does not. Same thing in the final beatitude, Luke 6:22, Matthew 5:11. Blessed are you when people hate you and do all sorts of nasty things to you and defame you or speak all kinds of evil against you. In Matthew, on my account. In Luke, on account of the Son of Man. It's very widely agreed that in these cases, Luke preserves the more original Q wording at both points, and Matthew has secondarily changed a reference to the Son of Man to a first-person singular, me or I. Whether the other bits of the saying are more original in Matthew or Luke, I won't go into here. It certainly seems unclear why, if Matthew's version was more original, with Jesus referring to himself as I or me, why Luke would have changed Matthew's first person to Son of Man. So it seems that as far as we can tell, Luke preserved Son of Man sayings from Q almost unaltered. It's very hard to find any clear instance where Luke might have modified a Son of Man saying from Q. Just one possible exception, the Son of Man saying that occurs in Matthew 19:28, where there is a rough parallel, but not a very clear parallel, in Luke 22:30. Matthew has, when the Son of Man is seated on the throne of his glory. There's no equivalent in the Lucan version of the saying. But on the other hand, it's very hard to reconstruct the original Q version with any certainty. And in any case, the Matthean version here that I put in red on the overhead here is absolutely thoroughly Matthean. The Son of Man having a throne, and a throne of his glory, is very, very close to the wording of Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, the beginning of the parable of the sheep and goats, when the Son of Man comes and is seated on his throne of glory. So Matthew may well have added this reference into Q. So whether this is Luke omitting a Son of Man reference from Q seems to me very unlikely. Apart from this anyway, Luke seems to have retained all the Son of Man sayings from Q, and he has preserved their wording unchanged for the most part. Luke's use of the Markan Son of Man sayings may reveal slightly more activity in changing and rewriting them. He doesn't seem to omit any Markan sayings of substance. The sayings are all retained, but some are rewritten, times almost quite radically in a way. If one looks at the third passion prediction in Mark 10:33 and Luke 18:31, in Mark, the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests, and all the things that are going to happen in the passion narrative will happen to him. In Luke, everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. It's a big rewrite in some ways, though it's arguably the same idea that might be expressed in the day of the first passion prediction. The Son of Man must suffer, and many have argued that behind that language of must suffer is a reference to perhaps the will of God, perhaps as written in Scripture, so that everything that is being foretold in Scripture will happen to the Son of Man and is part of the divine will. So Luke's rewriting here may be just expanding something that is implicit elsewhere in a Markan Son of Man saying. Rather more substantive Markan changes occur in Luke's redaction of the eschatological sayings from Mark, though even here the changes in wording are relatively small scale. For example, in Mark 9:1, as the second half of the saying about the coming of the Son of Man, who will be ashamed of those who are ashamed of Jesus and his words, which is the previous verse in Mark 8:38, and Luke has the same. Mark has Jesus then say in Mark 9:1, there are some of those standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power. Luke's version here omits that final phrase, come with power, that I've put in blue on the overhead here. There is no parallel in the Lucan version. And it's well known that Luke has a major concern about the delay of the parousia and its failure to materialize, certainly within the lifetime of the first generation of Christians. And it may be that this is then reflected here. What is coming in the lifetime of the present generation, what you will see, what those who are standing here will not taste death until they see, is not perhaps the kingdom of God coming in power in a cosmic parousia event, but rather the presence of the kingdom in a way that may be less visible universally, and seen in a less direct sense. In the saying at the Sanhedrin trial, Mark has Jesus say, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven, Mark 14:62. Luke omits the last phrase about coming with the clouds and also adds from now on at the start, Luke 22:69. From now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God, full stop. Which shifts the emphasis decisively away from an idea of a future coming of the Son of Man to one where the Son of Man is from now on seated at God's right hand in glory. And probably this too is part of Luke's concern to try to accommodate the delay of the parousia in relation to his own day and to avoid the suggestion that Jesus had predicted a parousia occurring in the lifetime of his present immediate hearers. The saying is no longer about a universally visible event in the future, which will be seen by the members of the Sanhedrin, but is reworded to become a claim about where Jesus is in the immediate future from now on. Luke keeps all the eschatological sayings from Q in Luke 17, with references to the day or the days of the Son of Man, with no apparent reserve at all. He also keeps the saying from Mark 13:26 about seeing the Son of Man coming on the clouds or a cloud of heaven. But the eschatological timetable which Luke sets out elsewhere in Luke 21 leaves plenty of space and time for a significant gap between Jesus' present and the future parousia. So he keeps sayings from Q about the Son of Man. He rewords sayings from Mark about the Son of Man to fit his ideas. Luke also has a number of other sayings which are peculiar to his gospel, sayings about the Son of Man which appear in Luke only. I've put a number up there on the overhead together. There's no time to go into details here. I think I would argue that a strong case can be made for claiming that many, if not all of them, are redactional creations by Luke. There is a saying in Luke 24:7 that is, not on this overhead, referring back to the Passion predictions about Jesus as the Son of Man, and that is clearly a redactional rewriting of the prediction in Mark 16:7 of a resurrection appearance in Galilee. For Luke, resurrection appearances take place in Jerusalem. Mark's prediction of a resurrection appearance, or whatever it is, in Galilee, he wants to get out of his gospel, and he rewrites that reference to Galilee and says, remember everything about what I said about the Son of Man's suffering in the past. But whatever their precise origin, whether they're Luke's creations or whatever, they are part of Luke's gospel. And even if they come to him from his own tradition, even if they're not his redactional creations, he presumably approved of them enough to include them in his gospel. Maybe noteworthy that all these sayings fit the general pattern of the sayings from Mark and Q in referring to a fairly broad but not unlimited range of the activity of Jesus. They refer to Jesus' present activity in saving others, to his suffering and death, and to his future role in the judgment, probably as judge. Luke 18:8, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Probably implying a judgment seat. And 21:36, the second one up there, pray that you may have strength to stand before the Son of Man. Again, probably in a judgment scene. But Luke does not go beyond his sources, for example, of speaking of Jesus' role as a teacher in terms of Son of Man language. He never says, well, Jesus the Son of Man sat down by the Sea of Galilee and taught them many parables. He never refers to Jesus as Son of Man as a miracle worker. He never says, Jesus, the Son of Man, took hold of the man with the withered hand and raised him up. So Luke may be creative in one way, but he stays within the broad parameter of his traditions as they are coming to him. The precise role which Jesus as Son of Man plays in the eschatological sayings is not always clear. For example, the reference to the day or the days of the Son of Man in Luke 17 leaves it very open precisely what role the Son of Man will play. The Son of Man has a day, but what exactly he's going to do on that day apart from appear is never said. The sayings in 18:8 and 21:36, the two ones here, both of which may be redactional creations, suggest that Jesus as Son of Man will have the role of judge. And the possible redactional nature of the sayings would suggest that that is Luke's own view. And this would be confirmed by two sayings in Acts, which clearly refer to Jesus having the role of judge in the future judgment, one of which I put down here at the end of this overhead, Acts 10:42, the one ordained by God as judge of the living and the dead, or 17:31 in the speech on the Areopagus in Athens, he, that is God, will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Clearly a reference to Jesus, but actually the name Jesus is not mentioned, and nor is there a reference to Jesus as Son of Man. Yet it is then striking that Luke is happy to reproduce the saying in Luke 12:8 about the Son of Man confessing others before the angels of God, because this suggests a role more of an advocate pleading the case before a judge, not being the judge himself. Yet Luke does not change that saying to make it fit what is probably his own view. The other thing to note at this point is that Luke makes virtually nothing at all of the notion of Jesus as Son of Man in Acts. In this, of course, Luke is not unique. One of the puzzling features of the phenomenon of the whole Son of Man problem is that the phrase is used frequently in all 4 canonical Gospels, but virtually nowhere else in the New Testament. In Acts, there is just one reference. In Acts 7:56, the third of the references here, the dying Stephen sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. The motif picks up the substance of the saying at the trial scene in Luke 22:69, and several commentators have noted the ways in which Luke seems to bring out the parallels between the accounts of the trial of death of Jesus in the Gospel and those of Stephen in Acts 7. Jesus acts as the role model and the stereotype for the first proto-martyr, Stephen. But that's the only occasion in Acts where the term Son of Man appears. Nowhere else in Acts is the phrase used of Jesus or of anyone. It's not mentioned at all in any of the speeches. And in the one place where Luke, somewhat unusually one must say, refers to a future judgment by means of an agent figure who is clearly Jesus in Acts 10:42 or Acts 17:31, there is no reference to Jesus as Son of Man, and indeed no reference by name to Jesus at all. In this, Luke may simply reflect widespread early Christian usage or early Christian non-usage. Despite the proliferation of uses in the Gospels, all the Gospels, the term does not appear to have caught on in any significant way amongst early Christians. A little later, I know, it comes to be used to refer to Jesus qua human being, contrasted perhaps with the term Son of God, referring to Jesus as a divine being. But both usages in this sense, I think, represent a significant shift from the use of either term in the gospel traditions, or for that matter, in the rest of the New Testament, certainly Paul. And Luke's silence then about Son of Man reflects the more general silence surrounding the term Son of Man in early Christian discourse. But simply to note here that Luke does not read this into this later non-usage into his gospel account. He takes on and hands on, almost unchanged, all the Son of Man sayings from Q and from Mark 2, though with some more changes, as I tried to say earlier. Thus, he does not allow the post-Easter situation to reflect his own presentation of Jesus' teaching. But he also appears to show significantly more respect for his Q source than he does for Mark. Even when the Q source does not quite agree with his own point of view, he leaves it unchanged. When Mark does not agree with what he wants to say, he seems more ready to change the wording accordingly. I would argue perhaps the same respect for Q traditions may be reflected in allusions to Isaiah 61, which occur in Luke Acts. In what's often seen as a vitally important programmatic scene for Luke in Luke 4:16-30, the Lucan Jesus comes to the synagogue in Nazareth, takes a scroll, and reads out loud the text from Isaiah 61. Luke 4:18 and 19, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. A very famous verse. The story is Luke's replacement for the rejection scene in Mark 6 and is often thought to reflect a number of significant motifs for Luke's subsequent story, highlighting them in this initial scene at the start of Jesus' ministry. And undoubtedly this is the case in many respects. The way in which, for example, the stories from Elijah and Elisha that Luke develops later in this pericope anticipate the Gentile mission of the future church, and also the prefigurement of Jesus' death and rejection by his own people in the note at the end of the pericope where the crowds try to throw Jesus down from the cliff. Yet it's striking, for me, that for all the prominent place that is given to the citation from Isaiah 61 in this citation in Luke 4, there's relatively little in the rest of Luke Acts that focuses on some of the details of this text. The verse in Acts 10:38 is an all but explicit interpretation of the reference in Isaiah 61 to the oppressed as those who have been oppressed by the devil, how he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil. But it has to be said that the theme of freeing those possessed by the devil is not a major theme necessarily in the gospel, though it occurs occasionally, and rarely surfaces in Acts. There are very few exorcisms in Acts. Nor do some of the other activities mentioned in the Isaiah 61 citation, sight for the blind or release for the prisoners, find more than an occasional echo in the story of Luke Acts. And indeed, the notion that Jesus is one who has been anointed by the Spirit seems somewhat unusual in Luke Acts. Elsewhere in the Gospel, the idea is not mentioned. Jesus never says, "because I possess the Spirit." And for the most part in Luke Acts, the Spirit is a phenomenon of the post-Easter Christian church sent at the risen Jesus' request from the Father. Luke 24:49, "I will ask the Father, and he will send the Spirit to you." The one feature of the Isaiah text that does resonate with a significant part of the Gospel and Acts is the theme of good news for the poor. Luke is very well known for his positive attitude to the poor, and this feature of the Isaiah quotation, as well as the language about evangelizing and bringing good news to, would surely have been very attractive to Luke. However, I wonder if there is some evidence to say that this scene in Nazareth, and indeed the whole idea of Isaiah 61, may have been rather more important for Q than perhaps it was for Luke. The idea that the Isaiah 61 and the Luke 4 story might have been in Q might be suggested by one agreement between Matthew 4:13 and Luke 4:16, where the place name of the village is given in a peculiar spelling, Nazareth. It's found solely at these two places. It's possible then that Luke found this story in a tradition which he shared with Matthew perhaps having decided to omit it here because he preferred the Markan version of the actual rejection scene itself. But the fact that the story comes to Luke from a tradition might then explain some slightly un-Lucan features of the citation of Isaiah 61. On its own, I realize that is not strong evidence, but it's also noteworthy that further references to Isaiah 61 do recur in other passages that come to Luke from Q and not elsewhere. The Beatitudes, which occupy a key position at the start of the Great Sermon, which is part of Q, open with a fairly clear allusion to the words of Isaiah 61 with the announcement of blessing on the poor. And it's widely regarded that Matthew's equivalent, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," is secondary. But then the wording of Matthew's second beatitude, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted," has a clear echo of Isaiah 61:2, "to comfort all who mourn." And Luke's version of this beatitude, which is his third beatitude, "Blessed are those who weep now, for you shall laugh," is less close to the wording of Isaiah 61. And Luke's language here, especially this reference to laughing, is somewhat unusual, especially in a Jewish context where laughing is more often than not something negative, not something positive. You laugh to scorn, not necessarily laugh because you are happy. So it may well be that Luke's wording here is secondary, and if so, it's quite striking that Luke may have changed the wording to be less similar to that of Isaiah 61. For Luke, it would seem then that any influence of the wording of Isaiah 61 is not that great. On the other hand, the wording of the language of Isaiah 61 may be very significant for Q. The second clear reference to Isaiah 61 in Q comes in the reply of Jesus to the messengers of John the Baptist, where Jesus tells them to say to John, "The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are evangelized." It's widely accepted that the words here allude to a number of Isaianic promises or visions of the future, with a clear reference to the words of Isaiah 61:1 in the final clause about the poor being evangelized. It would seem then that Isaiah 61 was an important text for Q. Arguably, Q starts with a reference to Jesus reading from the text of Isaiah 61 in Nazareth, and then Isaiah 61 exercises an important influence on at least two important passages which follow in Q, namely the opening Beatitudes, which clearly act as a kind of programmatic summary of Jesus' teaching that is so important for Q, and the reply of Jesus to the messengers of John the Baptist. Luke then takes this over, and he respects his source enough to include this material. He may well have been attracted by the positive reference to the poor receiving the good news of the Christian gospel. So in this respect, he heartily endorses what the source is saying. But the further details of the Isaiah 61 text are of less concern to him. So he interprets the reference to the oppressed as those suffering demon possession, not those necessarily oppressed by other human beings, though he does not make much of the rest of this in his two-volume work, and he's happy to leave the other references to the blind, to prisoners, and so on, unchanged. He may rewrite even one of the Beatitudes to reduce the similarity with the wording of Isaiah 61, removing the reference to comfort for those who mourn, using other language instead, maybe because he just simply didn't recognize the Isaianic allusion. Well, the picture that emerges, I would claim, is in line with what I've tried to argue so far. Luke is respectful, perhaps highly respectful, of his Q source. He values it, he finds in it things that are congenial to him, things that he wants to develop and expound in his own work, for example, the high value given to the poor and to evangelizing, bringing good news. But other details in his source may seem less significant to Luke, and hence he does not develop them further himself, but he still includes them in his gospel text out of respect for his sources. One final example of this general phenomenon might be seen in the presentation in Luke Acts of the theme of money and possessions. And the whole topic is extremely difficult precisely because Luke does not seem to present a consistent picture. The Q tradition, especially the Q mission charge, is well known for its instructions, which seem to imply that the disciples sent out by Jesus during his lifetime as missionaries are sent out with no possessions at all. They are to take nothing for their journey or even their daily needs. And this striking picture has then given rise to theories that the Q tradition was preserved amongst a group of what has been called wandering charismatics who moved from place to place with no settled existence. Theories development in the work of people like Tyson or Paul Hoffman. And once again, it is Luke who preserved this material. For example, Luke 10:4, Jesus telling the disciples, carry no purse, no bag, no sandals. In Matthew, there is no real mission during Jesus' lifetime. The mission instructions are assembled in the large discourse of Matthew 10, but unlike Matthew, the disciples are not actually sent out. And Luke is different, as is Mark. And in fact, the Lucan Jesus himself countermands his own previous teaching. Luke 22:35-36. When I sent you out without a purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? They said, no, not a thing. He said to them, but now the one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag. So ignore what I said earlier. Thereafter, the story in Acts in relation to the general topic of money and possessions is more than a little confusing. The earliest Jerusalem church seems to operate with a system of shared possessions so that no one individual owns anything, though it would appear too that the group is not financially destitute. They do have possessions, but the possessions are all held in common. Further, one gets the impression, though one may be wrong, that this mode of existence for a Christian group represents something of an ideal for Luke. Yet when the mission of the church spreads out, and especially when Paul takes center stage, the economic arrangement of the early Jerusalem church is not replicated. Many have pointed out that Paul's missionary activity, as evidenced from his letters, but also confirmed by the picture in Acts, presupposes quite an extensive network of supporters who provided him with financial support as well as accommodation, so that presumably some owned houses in which Paul can stay, and so on. He travels extensively and appears to have then at times some financial means at his disposal. But nowhere in Acts is there the slightest hint that this is in some way reprehensible, or that it reflects a sad decline from the ideal of the earliest Jerusalem church. The picture that Luke gives of Paul is completely positive without any qualification at all. So Luke again appears once again to respect the tradition of the teaching of Jesus that he receives, especially from Q, and he hands it on faithfully, though with a few changes here and there. But he is very aware that the situation of the time of Jesus is not the same as the situation of early Christians, and indeed that perhaps not all early Christians are expected to operate in the same way, financially or socially. What once was said by Jesus belongs to the past and cannot necessarily be repeated without change in a different later situation. So my conclusions: Luke may be a historian in the sense that he is aware of the fact that Jesus' lifetime now lies in the past, in perhaps a different era and a different social setting. So that while the teaching of Jesus is to be respected, highly respected, and he does write a full gospel giving full information about Jesus, and we should not play that significance down at all. Luke Acts is Luke Acts. Luke's gospel is there. It cannot necessarily be repeated unchanged in the new situations in which the Christian church finds itself in Luke's own day, or perhaps even in eras of the church which lie in the past for Luke. In terms of descriptions used in the past in scholarly discussions, Luke appears to be something, I would argue, of a conservative redactor. I think the phrase was first coined by Rudolf Pesch in relation to the evangelist Mark, with, for Pesch, I think, the emphasis lying firmly on the word conservative. I would suggest that Luke is both conservative but also a redactor. He is ready at times to rewrite his sources, and however conservative he might be in one way, we cannot simply read Luke Acts as a straight transcript of the historical events he describes. Yet the picture which may emerge from some of the evidence I've looked at in this lecture may suggest that Luke is rather more conservative with his Q source than he is with Mark. He does not seem to engage in rewriting Q in the way that he does with Mark, and he seems to content to reproduce elements of Q which are not necessarily ideas or themes which he is keen to develop on his own. His attitude to Q may then be slightly different to his attitude to Mark. He seems to be more respectful of Q than of Mark. As I noted earlier, if he is given a choice between Mark and Q when they overlap, he seems to prefer Q over against Mark. With both Mark and Q, he preserves traditions about Jesus which do not necessarily chime in with what he seems to think is applicable to his own day. The teaching of Jesus belongs in the past, and he is happy at times not to try to update everything to make it speak in the language of his own time. For all then that redaction criticism has highlighted Luke's and the other evangelists' own theological concerns in influencing their representation of the traditions about Jesus, it would seem that Luke has not allowed his own views to dominate his account completely. And this seems to be even more the case with Q than with Mark. For what it's worth, I would argue that the same may also be true in Matthew. Matthew engages in some rewriting of Mark in terms of substance, which is quite radical at times, especially, say, in relation to the law, on aspects of Christology, and so on. But I find it difficult to see so much critique in relation to Q, at least in terms of substance, although, of course, Matthew changes the wording at times here and there. In which case I regard it as slightly ironic that although Matthew and Luke both used Q, and perhaps both valued it and may have valued it even more than Mark, it was Q and not Mark which was lost to sight and did not survive in its own right. It only survives in the heritage it has left in the two canonical Gospels. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks.